Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a room you're not really supposed to be in. The air is thick with candle smoke and a faint perfume that's been lingering for decades, maybe centuries. Your fingertips brush over leather spines lined up on mahogany shelves, each diary tied shut with silk ribbons, each one fat with the weight of gossip, longing and whispered regret. You can almost feel the warmth of the hand that wrote them, elegant, gloved, and possibly shaking from the thrill of putting scandal into ink. You probably won't survive this without raising your eyebrows more than once. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling chatty, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm always curious who's out there, listening in the dark. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You run your hand over the nearest diary, its cover embossed with curling gold leaf. The initials are faded, but the flourish in the lettering suggests someone who enjoyed being admired, someone whose self-regard could fill an entire ballroom. The clasp opens with a sigh, as if even the book itself knows it's about to reveal too much. Inside, the ink is sepia, some strokes feathering where the quill paused a little too long. The first entry is dated 1723, and the handwriting is so precise you imagine the writer leaning over the page in a lace-trimmed sleeve, candlelight catching in the silver thread of their cuffs. They describe a supper party at the Duke's townhouse, a scene painted in roast pheasant, candied violets, and champagne fizzing in crystal flutes. It sounds polite, but the writer's tone is sly. One guest, accidentally, dropped a spoon down the back of another's chair, and a certain countess found her way to the balcony with a married man just as the music swelled inside. Historians still argue whether 18th century aristocrats truly lived in a constant state of flirtation, or if the memoirs we have simply amplify the juiciest details. But flipping through these pages, you get the sense that the truth was somewhere in the middle. Life at court was equal parts performance and survival. You kept your position not just by pleasing the monarch, but by staying relevant in the ever-shifting social weather. One quirky tidbit, a margin note about the Duchess's hat, which required its own footman to carry indoors. You picture the poor servant trailing behind with an arm full of feathers and satin, praying the thing doesn't topple. The diary doesn't explain why she needed such a spectacle for a Thursday supper, but maybe that was the point. No one could forget her if they tried. You notice how often the entries mention the placement of chairs. Who sat near whom wasn't just about convenience, it was strategy. Being positioned beside a certain lord might mean an inheritance rumour was about to begin, or that a new political alliance was in the works. And if you found yourself banished to the far end of the table, well, you might as well start packing for the countryside. As you read on, there's a moment where the diarist writes about a masked stranger at the edge of the room, watching them. No name, no description, just the feeling of being seen, not as one appears, but as one is. It's the kind of line that makes you pause, makes you want to flip ahead to see if they ever meet again, but you resist. These pages deserve to be read in order, scandal building like the slow pour of wine. Outside the library window you imagine the rains starting, the sound muffled by heavy drapes. Somewhere down the hall, a clock chimes the hour, late enough that the servants have gone to bed, leaving you alone with stories no one was meant to hear. You turn another page, feeling the paper thin and almost warm, as though the gossip still carries heat. One last note at the bottom catches your eye. To write is to confess without speaking. You wonder if that's why these diaries feel so alive, not because they record events, but because they let the writer live twice. And now, centuries later, you're living it with them. Candlelight flickering, scandal curling around you like smoke. You let the diary rest for a moment, the ribbon falling gently over the open page, and drift deeper into the imagery it conjures. The scene shifts from that hushed library to a ballroom blazing with candlelight, hundreds of wax flames shimmering in crystal chandeliers, throwing fractured rainbows across marble floors, polished so perfectly you could probably see the future in them if you stared long enough. The aristocrats arrive not just to dance, but to perform. You can almost hear the rustle of silk skirts, the soft jingle of gilded shoe buckles, the discreet cough of someone trying to draw attention without appearing to. Elegant scandal, after all, is an art form. No one ever rushes it. Every glance, every pause in conversation, every tilt of a head is deliberate, a brushstroke on a portrait that may take weeks to complete. The diarist writes of a particular ball at the Marquess's townhouse, a place renowned for its mirrored walls and for the way rumours seem to bloom there faster than orchids in a hothouse. Our writer notes that within an hour of arrival, a small but potent scandal had been conceived, birthed, and christened. The christening, naturally, took place in the form of whispered toasts over claret. Historians still argue whether such social gatherings truly held political power or if their importance was inflated by those who wrote about them. But even the dullest ball seems to have been fertile ground for manoeuvring. Guests positioned themselves as carefully as chess pieces, aware that a single conversation could redirect the flow of inheritance, land rights, or military commissions. One quirky tidbit buried in the entry: a count wore 2 left shoes all night, not because he was drunk, though that may have helped him endure the discomfort, but because he'd lent his right shoe to a visiting noble whose own had snapped a buckle mid-dance. The kindness was quietly noted, though the fashion faux pas was discussed for weeks afterward. The diarist explains how gossip travelled in these rooms. Like perfume, it clung to anyone who brushed against it, impossible to wash away entirely. A casual remark about someone's tardiness could evolve, by the end of the night, into speculation about affairs, debts, or impending disgrace. And unlike a duel which at least offered a clean end, these scandals could linger for years, resurfacing whenever a hostess needed to fill an awkward silence. You can see it clearly now, clusters of powdered wigs bending together, fans fluttering just enough to hide the movement of lips, eyes darting to check who's watching. In the far corner, a young viscount leans in too close to a married countess, their smiles just a shade too private. A nearby gentleman notices and adjusts his cravat 3 times before disappearing into the crowd, perhaps to find someone who'll listen. And then there's the music, swelling and sighing in the background. Harpsichord notes skip like gossip itself, quick, glittering, almost impossible to hold on to. A pair of dancers glide past you, their hands barely touching, yet the spark between them is strong enough to light the candelabra. The diarist closes the entry with a line that feels like a challenge. One does not simply attend a ball, one survives it. You smile to yourself, thinking how little that's changed. Swap the powdered wigs for red carpet gowns and you'd have the same spectacle today, just with faster gossip thanks to social media. You close the diary and glance at the stack beside you. Each promises a new scandal, a fresh performance, a reminder that in 18th century society the real dance happened far from the centre of the floor. And you can't help but lean forward, ready to step into the next scene. You slide the next diary toward you, its cover smelling faintly of lavender and dust. The edges are frayed, as if it was carried often, tucked into the folds of a gown or the pocket of a waistcoat, ready to capture the day's most delicate observations before they could fade. When you open it, the first page spills into a world of perfumed letters and coded phrases, a hidden language woven into the very paper. In 18th century aristocratic circles, writing a letter wasn't just about delivering words, it was a performance in ink. Every loop of a letter, every choice of stationery, every wax seal colour sent a message. The diarist explains how lovers and conspirators alike built entire relationships in carefully phrased sentences that, to an outsider, would seem utterly harmless. One mainstream fact leaps out. Aristocrats often used the language of flowers long before it became a formal Victorian fad. A sprig of rosemary pressed into a letter hinted at remembrance. A violet whispered of modest affection. A marigold could sting with a meaning of grief or rejection. And if the flower choice was too obvious, the writer might scatter petals between the pages, creating an intimate riddle for the recipient to solve. Historians still argue whether some of the more elaborate code systems were genuinely understood by their intended audiences or whether people simply pretended to know. After all, admitting you missed the message might mean confessing you weren't as clever or as close as you'd hoped. A quirky tidbit appears halfway down the page. The diarist recounts how one baroness supposedly sent her suitor a lemon with the rind delicately etched in symbols. The problem? The footman delivering it mistook it for a garnish and used it in the punch bowl. The resulting scandal was less about the romance and more about who ended up drinking the private message. You imagine the scene, powdered heads leaning over parchment by candlelight, the faint scratch of quills like moth wings against the stillness. Letters were folded in elaborate patterns, sealed with wax stamps unique to the sender. A broken seal, of course, was as revealing as an open door, and some entries in this diary practically hum with suspicion about intercepted correspondence. The diarist describes a system where lovers met in person only rarely, preferring to exchange written words via intermediaries, maids, footmen, even the occasional bribed coach driver. In an age when travel was slow and privacy scarce, the letter became a stage where the drama could unfold in safety. Well, in relative safety. You can picture one of these letters arriving, perhaps slipped discreetly under a tea saucer, perhaps hidden in the folds of a shawl. The recipient's fingers would linger on the wax seal a little longer than necessary, savouring the anticipation before breaking it. And yet, for every sweet declaration, there were also calculated threats, veiled in politeness. A rival might send a note filled with exaggerated compliments, each one just sharp enough to draw blood. Your dancing was the highlight of last night could easily mean you drew far too much attention, and it was noticed. The diary ends its section on an oddly tender note. A letter can lie more beautifully than a person, but it can also keep the truth warm until the right hands open it. You close the book slowly, feeling the weight of those words. Somewhere in the house you imagine a faint rustle, the sound of another sealed envelope sliding quietly into place, waiting to set the next scandal in motion. The next diary you draw from the stack is smaller, more portable, its worn leather cover creased, where a thumb must have rested hundreds of times. When you open it, the pages release the faint aroma of bergamot tea, as though the book has absorbed years of polite afternoons. This one is all about salons, those genteel gatherings where porcelain cups clinked softly and betrayal was served alongside sugar cubes. You picture the scene instantly, a high-ceiling drawing room flooded with afternoon light, the windows draped in pale damask. Ladies in pastel gowns sit in a semicircle, fans poised like small shields, while men in embroidered coats lean in with calculated ease. The table in the centre groans under trays of petit fours, lemon syllabub, and silver pots of steaming tea. Everything looks serene, until you notice the way certain glances dart across the room like thrown knives. The diarist describes how salon conversation followed a delicate rhythm. Publicly, it was about poetry, philosophy, or the latest political pamphlet. Privately, it was a testing ground for personal alliances and subtle power plays. Compliments could be weapons. Your gown is daring for the season might sound flattering, but it hinted at impropriety in a way that could ripple through the week's gossip. One mainstream historical fact comes in quietly. The salon was often run by a woman of influence called the salonière. Her guest list was carefully curated, ensuring just the right mix of talent, scandal, and potential drama. An invitation to her salon was a mark of social currency, but so was being excluded. Historians still argue whether these salons truly shaped political thought or simply mirrored the power games of the court. This diarist leans toward the latter, noting that no philosophy could survive the weight of a ruined reputation. A quirky tidbit hides halfway through the entry. One hostess apparently trained her cat to knock over teacups when a conversation turned to subjects she disliked. Whether that's true or not, the diarist swears they saw it happen, porcelain tilting precariously, just as a guest began to complain about the Queen's latest decree. The pages linger on the art of listening in without seeming to. Leaning forward too obviously might tip your hand, so the truly skilled gossips position themselves where voice is naturally carried, by the tea service near the open door, or in the alcove where guests admired imported orchids. A well-placed mirror could double as an early surveillance device, allowing you to watch lips move across the room without being noticed. And then there's the ritual of the departure. Guests would rise, smiling, thanking the hostess for such an enlightening afternoon, all while silently calculating who had scored a social victory and who had stumbled. The diarist writes of one particularly disastrous salon where a minor baroness, emboldened by too much brandied coffee, recited a love poem clearly meant for another guest's husband. The silence that followed could have frozen the cream in its pitcher. You imagine the sound of the salon fading now, the clink of cups replaced by the soft shuffle of departing slippers, the echo of laughter lingering just long enough to make you wonder if it was at your expense. Somewhere, the hostess closes her guest list book for the next gathering, already plotting who will sit beside whom and what tiny remark might set the room alight again. You set aside the tea-stained diary and reach for one with a cover so ornate it almost looks like a piece of furniture, deep red leather inlaid with strips of gold tooling, its corners reinforced with brass. It's heavier than the others, as if the weight of the scandals inside pulled more ink into the pages. The first entry plunges you straight into the concept of fashion as a weapon. The diarist wastes no time. One does not dress to be warm, nor merely to be admired. One dresses to cut. In the world of the 18th century aristocracy, clothing wasn't just fabric, it was strategy. Every ruffle, gemstone, and ribbon placement was a line in a speech you delivered without opening your mouth. A mainstream historical fact unfolds in lush detail. Fashion in the French and English courts was so politicized that a colour could signify loyalty to a faction. A lady wearing a gown in the Queen's favoured shade might secure a smile from the monarch. Wearing the rival's hue could mean chilly silence or worse, exclusion from important events. Men were no less subtle. The choice of waistcoat embroidery might declare your stance on a treaty without uttering a word. Historians still argue whether the excess of these wardrobes was driven more by personal vanity or political necessity. This diarist seems convinced it was both, noting that to be seen was to survive, but to be remembered was to win. Then comes the quirky tidbit, an account of the Duchess of Beaumont commissioning a hat, so tall it brushed the ballroom chandeliers. It had to be slightly tilted so she could enter rooms without stooping, and her rivals spread whispers that she used the extra height to eavesdrop on conversations. You can see it now, mirrors reflecting silk gowns so wide they could block a doorway, powdered wigs so heavy they required small, hidden wireframes, shoes with jewelled buckles worth more than a servant's yearly wage. Behind every sparkle, though, is intent, perhaps to remind a debtor of your wealth, to hint at a lover's gift, or to subtly mimic a rival's style so closely it becomes parody. The diarist describes one evening at the opera where a countess arrived in a gown embroidered entirely with silver thread, the pattern depicting a scene from a recent scandal involving her chief rival. No words were exchanged, yet the message was as clear as if she'd stood and read it aloud. The rival's expression remained politely frozen, but her fan moved with the urgency of a summer storm. And fashion wasn't only for public humiliation, it could be used for secret solidarity. A group of sympathetic courtiers might wear matching sashes or carry fans painted by the same artist to signal unity without risking a written record. The diary closes this section with a thought that lingers. A dagger can wound once, a gown can wound every time it is remembered. As you set the book down, you can almost hear the rustle of silk and the faint clink of a jewelled clasp being fastened, each sound another weapon readied for the battlefield of the ballroom. The next diary you pull free is lighter, bound in pale blue calfskin, its corners soft from years of being handled. When you open it, the first page is a splash of ink sketches, rough outlines of domino masks, feathered headdresses, and delicate lace eye covers. You've just stepped into the world of the masked ball, a place where the rules of daylight dissolve into something far more dangerous. The diarist begins with a confession. One attends a masked ball to forget one's name. In an age when identity was everything, anonymity offered a kind of intoxication no wine could match. You picture it instantly. The grand hall lit by hundreds of beeswax candles, the air heavy with perfume and anticipation. The music is faster here than in the salons, violins pulling dancers into whirling patterns where a stranger's gloved hand can linger without question. A mainstream historical fact slips in. Masked balls were often sponsored by royalty, especially in France, as a way to blur rigid social boundaries, at least for a night. Nobility could dance with commoners without scandal, or perhaps with scandal so well hidden under velvet masks that it became the point. Historians still argue whether these events were truly liberating or merely another arena for carefully managed intrigue. The diarist leans toward the latter, describing how some guests used their masks as decoys, sending a servant or accomplice to impersonate them while they slipped away for private encounters. Then comes the quirky tidbit, the account of a viscount who wore the same elaborate harlequin mask to 3 separate balls, each time pretending to be someone new. The trick only failed when a particularly observant marchioness recognized his distinctive limp and slightly overconfident waltz. You can feel the heat of the room, the crush of brocade and silk, the faint dampness of a gloved palm, the rush of trying to guess who's behind the mask brushing past you. Every voice is slightly muffled by fabric, every laugh a little freer. The diarist writes of overhearing 2 masked figures discussing a plot to manipulate the royal guest list for the next hunting season. One was certain they were speaking to a trusted ally. The other turned out to be the brother of their greatest rival. The page turns and the scene slows. In the candle-lit gallery above the ballroom, the diarist pauses, mask in hand, watching the crowd shift like a tide. Someone, a stranger in a simple black mask, meets their gaze for a heartbeat longer than is proper. Nothing is said, but the diarist admits the moment lingered like the last note of a minuet. And then there's the unmasking at midnight, a tradition both feared and anticipated. Some wore disguises so elaborate they were unrecognizable until the very last moment, savoring the shock on familiar faces. Others kept their masks in place well past the appointed hour, daring anyone to challenge them. The diarist ends the entry with a thought as light as a sigh. In a mask, one can tell the truth without consequence. But when the mask is gone, the truth remains. You close the diary and can almost hear the fading music, the sweep of capes against marble floors, and the rustle of secrets folding back into silence until the next invitation arrives. The next diary in the stack is bound in black leather, with its edges worn smooth like a well-handled playing card. It feels heavier than its size suggests, as though the weight inside isn't paper, but the tension of too many eyes watching the same person. The first line is written in a darker ink, as if the diarist pressed the quill harder than usual. When the king looks at you, everyone else does too. Tonight, you find yourself in a great hall alive with the hum of conversation, though every whisper seems to loop back to one man, the monarch. His gaze is not so much a glance as it is an event. You see it happen. A smile in his direction earns a raised eyebrow from a rival. A misplaced laugh near his seat can spark rumors before the servants clear the first course. A mainstream historical fact surfaces in the text. At the 18th century French and English courts, the king's favor could change a person's fortune overnight. A nod might result in new land grants or a coveted appointment. A slight could mean exile to the countryside, stripped of influence. The diarist explains that courtiers became experts at reading even the smallest change in expression, like gamblers reading the twitch of a card player's hand. Historians still argue whether the monarchs of this era actively manipulated such attention for amusement or if it was simply the inevitable gravity of their position. This diarist, however, believes it was deliberate, noting that a bored king is a dangerous king. The quirky tidbit here is almost absurd. During one banquet, the king's gaze lingered on a tray of sugared almonds, prompting every guest to request almonds that evening for their own tables, as if it were a commandment from the throne. Almond prices in the capital doubled within a fortnight. You watch the ripple effect in real time. The king's wandering eye lands on a young viscountess standing near the musicians, and suddenly half the hall seems to turn toward her. Her cheeks flush, not entirely from flattery, because the man beside her is not her husband. By the end of the night, the diarist writes, 2 duels had been quietly arranged and 3 friendship circles permanently fractured. In these moments, the king doesn't need to speak. The power lies in implication, in the knowledge that anyone under his gaze becomes a mirror reflecting his mood. The diarist admits to sometimes stepping into that line of sight deliberately, wearing just the right shade, speaking just loudly enough to be noticed. Risky, yes. But for those who craved advancement, risk was the only currency worth spending. The entry closes with a note you can almost hear in a low, conspiratorial voice. It is not the favor you must fear losing. It is the moment when you are no longer worth watching. You set the diary down, the air in the imagined hall still thick with unspoken calculations, and you can almost feel the weight of that invisible gaze, looking for its next target. The diary you lift next is bound in dark green leather, its corners slightly dented as though it's been packed and unpacked in travel trunks too many times. Inside, the handwriting tilts forward, quick and impatient, as if the author couldn't get the words out fast enough. The first page drops you into the pale blue haze of dawn on the outskirts of a city, where 2 men in powdered wigs face each other across a patch of damp grass. The diarist writes without flourish here, just crisp details, the smell of wet earth, the metallic glint of rapiers catching first light, the distant sound of carriage wheels as onlookers arrive late. Duels over dignity, the author reminds you, were not rare. In the 18th century aristocracy, a slighted reputation was treated like an open wound, and sometimes the only cure was steel at sunrise. A mainstream historical fact emerges naturally. While pistols were becoming the fashionable choice for resolving such disputes by the mid-1700s, swords remained popular among traditionalists, especially in France, because they were seen as a more honourable test of skill. The diarist notes, however, that honour was a flexible term. Some duels were fought over genuine insults, others over rumours no one could prove had ever been spoken. Historians still argue whether most duels were actually intended to kill or simply to stage a public reconciliation after a symbolic injury. This diarist leans toward the latter, citing one incident where both combatants left with identical scratches on opposite arms, as if arranged in advance for maximum drama and minimal inconvenience. Then comes the quirky tidbit, the tale of a marquis who challenged a rival over an alleged flirtation with his wife, only for it to be revealed halfway through the duel that the rival had mistaken which wife was being discussed. Both men reportedly laughed so hard they abandoned the fight entirely, sharing brandy before breakfast. Still, not all duels ended in laughter. The diarist recounts one especially tense morning when the mere arrival of a certain baron, known for his lethal precision, was enough to make his opponent feign illness. The baron's sigh of disappointment is described as louder than any pistol shot. You can feel the choreography of it all, the bow, the measured steps, the deliberate turn. It's as much theatre as it is threat. Spectators, carefully spaced along the edges, murmur in low voices, their breath misting in the cold air. A dropped glove in this world is a loaded sentence. Picking it up means you're willing to put your life where your pride is. The diarist closes this entry with a warning that sounds timeless. A duel is rarely about what is said. It is about who will be believed afterward. You place the diary back on the stack, the image of those 2 figures in the fog still lingering, knowing that in this society the fight was never truly over when the swords were sheathed. The diary you open now is unlike the others. Its cover is plain, almost modest, as though trying not to draw attention. But when you flip it open, the first page blooms with colour. A detailed sketch of a woman's face, her eyes half-lidded in a private smile, her hair powdered and dressed high with pearls woven through. Beneath the portrait, a single line is written, "For your eyes only." You've stepped into the private portrait game, a silent, risky exchange that lived somewhere between art and confession. In the 18th century, having your likeness painted wasn't unusual, but commissioning something intimate, something meant for only one viewer, was another matter entirely. A mainstream historical fact emerges in the diarist's careful script. Miniature portraits, tiny, often oval paintings no bigger than a pocket watch, were the era's preferred token for lovers. Easy to hide in a drawer or locket, they carried more danger than letters because the resemblance was undeniable. Unlike a rumour, a portrait didn't need words to tell its story. Historians still argue whether these portraits were usually commissioned with the subject's full consent, or if some were created from memory, or even from stolen glances. This diarist suspects both. In one entry, they describe a nobleman who kept a miniature of a woman he claimed never to have met, insisting it was an artistic exercise. Few believed him. Then comes the quirky tidbit. A countess once commissioned a portrait of her lover dressed as a mythological hero, complete with laurel wreath and artfully draped toga. The painter, perhaps out of loyalty or perhaps mischief, included a small, unmistakable mole just above the man's collarbone. For weeks, every social gathering turned into a guessing game, men discreetly tugging at their cravats, women watching closely for the telltale mark. You picture the quiet transaction, the artist's studio smelling faintly of linseed oil and beeswax, the soft drag of a brush over primed ivory. Outside, the carriage waits with curtains drawn, ready to whisk the finished piece to a velvet-lined case. The diarist describes how recipients often reacted in private, tracing the curve of a cheek with a fingertip, or placing the miniature beneath their pillow for a single night before locking it away. And yet these treasures were also liabilities. A stolen portrait could become a weapon, proof enough to ruin reputations or fuel blackmail. One page tells of a young gentleman whose miniature of a married woman fell into her husband's hands. The husband publicly declared it a fine likeness of a cousin, but quietly withdrew from several key alliances shortly after. The entry ends with a lingering thought. Paint can outlast breath. One must be careful what one allows it to say. As you close the diary, you can almost feel the weight of those tiny portraits, too small to command a wall, yet heavy enough to shift the balance of an entire life. You reach for a diary so slim you almost miss it, the sort of book a person might tuck inside an apron or slip behind a wine rack. The leather is plain, the corners rubbed bare, but when you open it, the script inside is neat as silverware laid for a state dinner. This one isn't written by a duchess or a viscount, it's written by someone who walked a step behind them. Tonight you follow the servants who know too much. You move through the great house as they do, early, quiet, and invisible by design. Before dawn, the scullery maid is already coaxing heat from a sleepy hearth. By the time the first bell rings upstairs, the hallways smell of beeswax, coffee, and ambition. Your shoes hush over runner carpets that never seem to wear out. A mystery solved by the fact that a boy, no older than 12, has been beating them senseless in the courtyard since sunrise. You pass the butler's pantry, the linen press, the hidden stair that zips servants up and down the house like notes moving along a musical scale. A mainstream historical fact lands with the certainty of a well-placed decanter. In 18th century aristocratic households, valets and ladies' maids handled clothes, letters, and bodies, yes, bodies, in a way even spouses sometimes did not. They saw the stains that told stories, the ripped hem that did not match the tail, the miniature portrait hidden in a pocket, the pressed violet between pages. The butler ran the wine and the household accounts. The housekeeper controlled keys, stores, and reputations. The cook fed not only stomachs but schedules, for nothing in a great house happened until the source agreed. Historians still argue whether servants amplified scandal or discreetly smothered it. Some memoirs insist that the staff, bound by pride and pay, maintained a professional hush. Others suggest that quiet corridors were highways of information, with tidbits paid in tips, favours, and the occasional day off. Your diary's author, let's call them the hand behind the tray, keeps it simple. Silence is service, but information is insurance. You slip into a dressing room just as a valet eases a silk coat over his master's shoulders. The mirror reflects two faces, one powdered, one patient. The valet sees everything, the smudge of lipstick that isn't the wife's shade, the faint tremor brought on by last night's gaming table, the almond tucked, still always, into the waistcoat because a certain king once looked at a bowl and the market panicked. Almonds again, the valet murmurs, and you can hear the ghost of a smile. The master doesn't answer, which is answer enough. Down the corridor, a lady's maid is brushing out a powdered tower of hair with the calm precision of a locksmith. Pins, ribbons, a discreet ribboned packet that is slipped into a drawer without comment. She notices the faintest scent of lemon on her mistress's gloves. Curious, since lemons haven't appeared at table since the punch bowl incident. You remember the coded rind that ended up flavouring half the party, and you try not to laugh. An aristocracy can withstand war, famine and tax reform, but it never recovers from a citrus-based miscommunication. Servants know the map of the house by heart, where whispers echo and where they vanish, which floorboards complain, which windows open without squeal. They carry letters to the back gate, trade them for others sealed in red wax, and return by a route that skips the gallery with the private portraits, those tiny faces that cause big trouble. If a seal arrives broken, no one asks the footman how the crack appeared. If a note smells faintly of violets, no one asks the maid why her apron does too. A quirky tidbit slides into the record like a spoon into syllabub. The butler, it seems, once labelled 2 decanters for a private supper, truth and silence. The guests laughed and asked for both. By evening's end, everyone was very truthful and extremely silent, which is how you know the labels were accurate. You picture the servants' hall at the edge of the world upstairs. The long table is scratched with initials. The fire is a little meaner than the one in the great hall, but warmer in spirit. Here, news is sorted like laundry. Fresh rumours on one bench, older ones folded and put away. A stubborn stain sent down to the kitchen to simmer with the stew. An under-housemaid reports seeing the Duchess's hat, remember the one with its own footman, resting upside down on a chair like a captured ship because the new chandelier refuses to negotiate. The scullery boy mimics the swish-swish of a rival countess's fan, using a dishcloth with such panache that 3 adults choke on laughter they're not supposed to have. You drift to the back staircase, the artery of the house, where a page lingers long enough to hear a pair of gentlemen discussing a duel at dawn. You think back to the foggy meadow and the polite scratches that looked suspiciously rehearsed. The page has no love for rapiers, but he has a genius for errands. Within an hour, a certain lady's maid accidentally routes a note toward a peacemaker, and the duel becomes a breakfast meeting featuring brandy and wounded pride served sunny side up. On the surface, nothing happened. Beneath, the household's quiet surgery prevented a scandal hemorrhage. There are rules to this invisibility. Servants do not look straight at certain things the way one does not stare at the sun. If they must know, they learn to know sideways. The diary lists a simple code. Hear once, forget twice. See once, remember always. Speak never unless sacked, and then only to the cat. You flash on the salon hostess whose cat toppled teacups on command and decide this animal union is more organized than Parliament. In the evening, a hairdresser, part artisan, part confessor, arrives with a trunk of pomades, pearl pins, and whispered opinions from 3 other houses. The hand behind the tray notes how tradespeople function as diplomatic couriers. The milliner knows which lady is suddenly fond of black. The violin teacher knows whose lessons now occur at suspicious hours, and the pastry cook knows where the sugared almonds vanish fastest. When the hairdresser leaves, the corridor glitters with a breadcrumb trail of gossip no one admits to following. Sometimes the diary turns tender, The writer describes sitting with a young governess after the children are abed, mending a torn book spine and listening to rain batter the orangery glass. The governess confesses a soft spot for a footman who recites bits of Voltaire he hears through half-closed doors. He misquotes courageously, she says. In a world where everyone performs, the honesty of a misquote feels like a luxury. And sometimes the diary turns sharp. There is an entry about a visiting gentleman who attempts to tip information out of the staff like wine from a bottle. He finds nothing but the butler's gaze, cool, polished, and a degree colder than the silver. The next day the gentleman discovers his hunting boots have been mislaid, and his invitation to the country estate quietly shortened. He will tell people it was his decision to leave early. Everyone will nod. The boots remain admirably lost. Not everything the servants catch is scandal, much of it is ache. A slipped miniature tucked back into its case by hands that will never own one. A bouquet of violets left on a windowsill by someone who can't sign the note. A cravat retied so a tremor won't show. They witness courage in tiny doses, a lady walking into a ballroom in a gown that answers a rival's insult stitch for stitch, a gentleman bowing to the king with a smile that survives the weight of being ignored. Historians still argue, the diarist writes again, whether houses like this were kept standing by money, rank, or fear. They forget the other mortar, their habit of doing the next thing properly. Breakfast laid, ink refilled, wax warmed, fans repaired. The mechanics of grace. You pass once more through the library where you began, the air still heavy with old perfume and paper that remembers every hand that turned it. On a side table sits a folded letter sealed with plain wax. You don't open it. You don't need to. You already know the route it will take. Down the back stairs, along the service corridor, into a pocket where it will rest against a warm palm that understands the difference between carrying a message and delivering a life. Before you close the slim diary, a final line glows in the candlelight. We clean the mirrors no one looks into. You think of the faces that pass in those mirrors, masked, powdered, painted, then of the unpainted faces behind them, steady as hands pouring wine. The house exhales. Somewhere upstairs a fan snaps shut like a verdict, and downstairs a cat, undoubtedly union certified, knocks a spoon to the floor at exactly the wrong and right moment. You set the book on the stack, hearing the quiet syllable of leather on wood, and you feel the whole machine of the house humming from cellars to chandelier. The servants keep its rhythm, they keep its secrets, they keep it from falling down. The diary you pick up next is bound in worn brown calfskin, its spine cracked from years of being folded open on a traveller's knee. The waxy scent of old leather mixes with something faintly metallic, perhaps ink made from iron gall. Inside, the pages are filled with sprawling handwriting that loops with the confidence of someone who knows their audience will never be allowed to read what they've written. Tonight you step into the realm of travel diaries and the exotic lies they so often contained. The diarist begins with a flourish. I have just returned from lands so distant they may as well have been painted on the horizon by a dreamer. You can almost see them setting the stage for the reader, or perhaps for themselves, because travel writing in the 18th century was rarely pure observation. It was performance, equal parts truth, embellishment, and competitive one-upmanship. A mainstream historical fact emerges quickly. Travel diaries of aristocrats were often circulated among friends and family upon their return, sometimes even copied out by hand to share with wider circles. These accounts served as proof of culture and refinement, trophies of experience in an age when most people would never leave their own country, but they were also reputation-building tools, especially in salons, where dropping the phrase, "when I was in Constantinople," could silence a rival mid-sentence. Historians still argue how much of these travel records was genuine. Letters from the period reveal complaints about armchair travellers, those who wrote vivid accounts of places they had never visited, piecing them together from other people's stories and engravings sold on street corners. This diarist gleefully admits to mixing fact and fiction like cream into coffee, smooth, inseparable, and pleasing to the palate. A quirky tidbit surfaces halfway down the page. The diarist claims to have attended a banquet in Venice where the dessert was served floating on a miniature gondola in the centre of the table. Did it happen? Possibly. Was the gondola carved from sugar, silver, or imagination? The diarist leaves that part tantalizingly blank. You follow them through entries that shift between precise detail and outright fantasy. One page describes the texture of Cairo's market spices so vividly you swear you can smell cardamom and cumin. The next claims they saw a lion the size of a carriage while riding near the Atlas Mountains, an animal, they note slyly, that no one else in the party managed to glimpse. The diary reveals that travel for this crowd was often less about seeing new worlds than about being seen in them. Portraits would be painted in front of famous landmarks or backdrops that only pretended to be. Outfits would be tailored to reflect local styles, exotic enough to impress back home, but never so authentic as to lose the shine of European superiority. One entry makes you pause, a description of an illustrious tea house in Canton where the diarist writes of a hostess who served each guest by name without being told who they were. It sounds improbable, like something polished for effect, but there's a wistfulness in the way they note her farewell. May your journey return you to yourself. And there's the danger too, because a travel diary could be a weapon. A rival's missteps abroad could be immortalized in ink, a botched attempt to ride an unfamiliar animal, an unfortunate misunderstanding at a foreign table, or the more serious offense of failing to pay proper respect to local customs. The diarist hints at several such incidents, recording them in a way that ensures the reader will recognize the subject without ever naming them. The entry ends with a wry observation. It matters less whether I have been everywhere I say I have. What matters is that they believe I could have been. You close the diary, feeling the mingled scent of fact and fiction still hanging in the air, and you realize that in these pages travel isn't about miles crossed. It's about reputations carried home in silk-lined trunks. The next diary you draw from the stack is heavy and solid, its cover a deep plum leather with gold tooling faded to the colour of weak tea. The clasp still works, though it resists a little, as if guarding the ledger of human desire hidden inside. When it finally yields, you're greeted by precise, almost accountant-like handwriting. The opening line reads, "Wealth is best dangled, never delivered." This diary belongs to someone who clearly sat close to the fires of inheritance and intrigue, those smoky corners of 18th century aristocratic life where the promise of a fortune could pull people into alliances they'd never consider otherwise. A mainstream historical fact emerges early. In many aristocratic families, inheritances were not fixed. Wills could be, and often were, altered in response to shifting loyalties, marriages, and even petty arguments. It wasn't unusual for a favoured nephew to become suddenly unfavoured after a slight at dinner, or for a daughter's dowry to shrink because she married someone who failed to impress the family matriarch. Historians still argue whether this constant state of uncertainty made heirs more ambitious or more cautious. The diarist leans firmly toward ambition, describing soirees where conversations sounded pleasant but were really negotiations in disguise. A flattering remark about someone's new hunting lodge could be a subtle bid for inclusion in a will. A sudden offer to sponsor a godchild's christening might be a calculated move to cement one's place in an aging relative's affections. Then comes the quirky tidbit, an anecdote about a famously wealthy baronet who kept a list of possible heirs written in invisible ink, changing the order every few months just to keep everyone guessing. The list, according to the diarist, was eventually discovered when a guest accidentally spilled lemon juice on the paper while sweetening their tea. The resulting scene, names flickering into view as steam rose, was, in the diarist's words, worth more than any inheritance. You follow the diarist through accounts of calculated courtships, where heirs-to-be were paraded like racehorses before potential benefactors. One widow, immensely rich and only vaguely fond of her living relatives, developed a habit of inviting suitors to her country estate under the guise of quiet family visits. These weekends were anything but quiet, featuring competitive garden strolls, strategically overheard piano performances, and the occasional accidental moonlit walk that left rival claimants fuming. It's easy to see how money became both bait and snare. A sudden change of fortune could draw new friends as quickly as it repelled old ones. The diarist recalls a viscount who inherited unexpectedly at 32. Within weeks, his guest list tripled, but so did the number of malicious rumors about his spending habits. The pages drip with sly observations. The promise of gold, the diarist writes, makes people mistake performance for sincerity. They forget that in this theatre, the audience is also the playwright. One passage stops you for a moment. It describes an aging dowager who, tired of the endless courtship of her fortune, began giving away small but dazzling items, an emerald brooch here, a pair of diamond shoe buckles there. She claimed it was generosity. The diarist claims it was a test, watching who would stay once the baubles were gone. The entry ends with a note that feels half warning, half shrug. A will is the only love letter that cannot be answered. You close the diary slowly, feeling the quiet pull of those silk threads of wealth, threads strong enough to bind families together or snap them apart with the flick of a pen. The diary you choose next is bound in soft moss-green leather, the edges faintly frayed, as if it has been carried through gardens more than libraries. A pressed sprig of lavender lies between the pages, brittle but still aromatic when you lift it. The opening line draws you instantly into its world. The moonlight tells the truth better than daylight ever could. Here, the diarist leads you through the manicured hedges and shaded walks of forbidden gardens where whispered promises vanish with the morning dew. These are not public promenades for polite society. They are carefully curated labyrinths, walled, secluded, and designed to hide more than flowers. A mainstream historical fact surfaces quickly. In many aristocratic estates, private gardens were planned with both aesthetics and discretion in mind. High hedges, winding paths, and small follies, those decorative pavilions or temples, created pockets where two people could meet without being easily seen from the house. Sometimes these gardens were deliberately designed by the estate owner for private diplomacy, a euphemism as useful for affairs of the heart as for politics. Historians still argue whether the majority of these midnight meetings were about love or strategy. The diarist suggests they were often both. In one entry, they describe overhearing a conversation that began with poetry and ended with a verbal agreement to back a candidate for Parliament. Then comes the quirky tidbit. A certain earl had a small footbridge installed over a reflecting pond, purely so his clandestine guests could cross without risking damp hems or muddy shoes. The diarist dryly notes that the bridge was built for romancy, but more often used for retreat. You follow them along gravel paths crunching softly under embroidered slippers, the air thick with night-blooming jasmine. Somewhere in the distance, an owl calls. Closer, two figures pause in the moonlight, their silhouettes framed by the pale stone of a garden folly. No one speaks for a moment, but the way one hand drifts toward the other says everything. The diarist writes about the strange tension of these encounters, the thrill of being hidden, just out of sight, paired with the knowledge that a single, misplaced cough or a gust of wind could shatter the illusion of privacy. One particularly vivid entry recalls a lady's veil being caught on a rosebush mid-escape. She tore it free, but left behind a piece of lace that by morning had been noticed, discussed, and assigned to 3 different women. The garden was a stage, but one with no script and no stage manager. The diarist captures the sensory details with care, the cold kiss of marble when leaning against a statue for balance, the faint clink of a locket chain against a throat, the way perfume grows stronger in the dark air, as if emboldened by secrecy. There's a line almost tossed away that feels like the truest thing in the whole entry. The garden forgets by sunrise, but people do not. As you close the diary, you imagine those pathways still stretching away into the night, curving out of sight, each turn hiding the story that may never have reached the safety of ink, except here, in this quiet book that smells faintly of lavender and scandal. The diary you reach for now is heavier than expected, bound in midnight blue leather with silver filigree curling at the corners. When you open it, the ink inside is darker, sharper, as though the writer's pen had been dipped in something colder than mere gall. This one begins abruptly, without preamble. A salon is only polite until someone is clever. You find yourself in a grand drawing room lit by tiered chandeliers, their light glinting off gilt frames and mirrored panels. At first glance, the scene is genteel. Ladies in embroidered gowns, gentlemen in frock coats, cups of steaming chocolate cradled in porcelain hands. But the diarist wastes no time explaining that these salon debates could turn dangerous faster than a flame-catching dry lace. A mainstream historical fact emerges here. Salons in the 18th century were crucibles for the exchange of ideas, political, philosophical, literary. The most influential salons were often hosted by women who skillfully curated guest lists to balance wit, rank, and opposing viewpoints. These gatherings could incubate revolutions of thought, if not always of blood. Historians still argue whether salon culture genuinely advanced social equality or merely provided the elite with a fashionable way to argue. The diarist leans toward the latter, noting with acid humor that equality is always charming when one is seated in the better chair. The quirky tidbit arrives in the form of a duel disguised as wordplay. The diarist recalls an evening when a visiting poet slyly questioned a nobleman's grasp of ancient history. The nobleman, unwilling to show ignorance, responded with a confidently wrong anecdote about Julius Caesar's visit to Constantinople, a city that did not exist in Caesar's time. The room went utterly still, then erupted in applause from those too polite, or too strategic, to correct him. The diarist adds, "I said nothing but made a note for later use." You can hear the shift in tone as the debates deepen. Voices lower, words sharpen. A gentleman quotes Voltaire with just enough emphasis to suggest that the marquise across from him has misapplied the concept entirely. A lady counters with a philosophical example that could just as easily be a thinly veiled jab at another's recent financial misstep. Laughter ripples around the room, but you notice it is louder on one side than the other. The diarist describes these moments as a war of temperature, when a conversation is heated enough to burn but not so hot as to scorch the tablecloth. Yet the danger lies in the embers left behind. Days later, a misplaced invitation or an altered seating chart might reveal that the salon's polite skirmish had lasting consequences. There is a quiet power in who chooses to speak and who chooses to watch. The diarist writes of a baroness who never raised her voice, yet always seemed to leave with more allies than she arrived with. Her weapon was not her wit, the diarist notes, but her timing. As the evening in this entry winds down, the hostess rises, smiles, and declares the discussion most enlightening. Servants sweep in with trays of candied fruits and cordial glasses, a gentle cue for the combatants to sheath their words. But the diarist's final line warns otherwise. In salons, nothing ends with the closing of the door. It only pauses until the next time someone is clever. You close the midnight blue diary, still feeling the hum of unsheathed wit in the air, and imagine the long, careful silence that must have followed in the carriage rides home. The next diary is bound in soft dove-grey leather, almost the colour of storm clouds just before rain. A delicate silver clasp holds it shut, the kind of clasp that looks decorative until you notice the tiny keyhole, suggesting that whatever is inside was not meant for idle browsing. When you open it, the handwriting is neat and balanced, each letter perfectly measured, as though the writer took as much care with their script as the people in the pages took with their appearances. The first sentence slips you straight into the heart of a gilded drawing room. Families smile together in oil paint more easily than they do in life. Here, the diarist leads you into the world of love triangles, arranged, disguised, and immortalized in carefully staged family portraits. A mainstream historical fact unfolds early. In the 18th century, portrait painting was a deliberate act of self-fashioning. Families hired renowned artists not just to record their likeness, but to cement their place in history, to show wealth, unity, and propriety. The positioning of figures, the direction of a gaze, even the placement of a hand, could convey messages, some subtle, some blatant. Historians still argue whether viewers at the time could read these hidden dynamics as clearly as we think we can now. The diarist believes they could, noting that a tilt of the head toward one figure and away from another is as plain as signing your name in ink. Then comes the quirky tidbit. An account of a viscount who insisted on having his wife and his mistress both included in the same family portrait, disguised as a dear family friend. The painter, either out of mischief or solidarity, placed the two women's hands so close together that the fingers almost touched, an intimacy that caused murmurs for years. You imagine stepping into the studio, the smell of oil paints and varnish, the faint rustle of silk as sitters adjust themselves into postures designed to flatter or conceal. A child might be placed strategically between a husband and wife to suggest unity. A loyal hound at someone's feet could imply fidelity, whether or not such fidelity existed. The diarist describes how some sitters used the session itself as a battlefield. A wife might accidentally wear a necklace gifted by another admirer, forcing the artist to paint it. A husband could rest his hand on the shoulder of the wrong person, knowing full well it would be noticed later. The portrait became both a frozen image and a permanent record of where affections, or betrayals, lay at that moment in time. One particularly sharp observation lingers. Paint dries, but it does not forgive. Because once a portrait was completed, it could not be easily altered without obvious signs of tampering. Scandals might fade from conversation, but they remained alive in the faces and postures hanging on drawing-room walls. The entry ends with a scene at a grand unveiling. The artist pulls away the cloth, and polite applause fills the air. But in the corner of the room, a dowager aunt is staring intently at the angle of one young man's gaze toward a certain lady. The diarist notes simply, "By dessert, half the room had seen it too." You close the dove-grey diary, imagining the generations who would pass beneath those painted eyes, never knowing or never admitting that the smiles on the canvas were edged as sharply as any duel at dawn. The diary you choose next is bound in dark burgundy leather, the edges slightly warped from humidity, as if it once spent too long in a bedside drawer near a water jug. When you open it, the ink is pale brown, the strokes light and deliberate, like someone writing while glancing often over their shoulder. The first line wastes no time. "The doctor hears truths no priest will." You're ushered into the candle-lit stillness of a physician's private chamber, the kind reserved for those in high society whose ailments and indiscretions could not be left to the gossip of public infirmaries. Here, the physician's discretion is both an expectation and a form of currency. A mainstream historical fact appears early. In the 18th century, aristocrats often retained private physicians who not only treated illnesses, but also managed delicate conditions that could damage reputations if revealed. These doctors were as much confidants as healers, privy to the intimate details of marriages, affairs, and indiscretions concealed under the guise of medical necessity. Historians still argue whether such physicians truly acted out of loyalty or simply understood that their livelihoods depended on silence. The diarist, clearly acquainted with one such doctor, suggests it was a balance, loyalty bought and maintained with generous retainers, fine gifts, and the unspoken promise of continued influence. The quirky tidbit here makes you pause. A certain baroness reportedly summoned her physician not for illness, but to certify that her pallor was fashionably delicate, rather than genuinely sickly. The doctor obliged, even prescribing her powdered sugar lozenges to maintain the look. The diarist notes she was in perfect health and perfect scandal. The pages glide through examples of medical discretion in action, the sudden, extended stays at country estates that coincided suspiciously with due dates, the quiet treatment of injuries sustained in duels never reported, the concoction of tonics to calm nerves that were really designed to temper tempers before important negotiations. The diarist describes one physician's black leather bag as heavier with secrets than instruments. There's a scene you can see clearly, a young nobleman seated on a padded stool, shirt unbuttoned, while the doctor listens gravely to his story of a fall from a horse. The diarist dryly adds, "Horses do not carry rapiers." The doctor simply nods, binds the wound, and sends the man home with both bandages and instructions to say nothing. The writing here lingers on the quiet authority of these medical figures. A physician could refuse to confirm or deny a rumour, effectively killing it, or let a slight pause before answering feed speculation, for weeks. Even the actor being seen entering or leaving their rooms could shift social tides. The diarist ends with a story half in shadow, a royal mistress who disappeared from court for 3 months, her absence explained as treatment for a lingering fever. When she returned, looking healthier than ever, the court accepted the explanation without question, except for the physician who, according to the diarist, received a sudden elevation in both income and influence. The final line lingers like the scent of herbs in the doctor's bag. A cure heals the body. Discretion preserves the life one wishes to keep. You close the burgundy diary, feeling the weight of all the untold stories folded into its pages, knowing that somewhere those careful hands still keep their grip on truths no one else will ever hear. The diary you pick up now is small but unusually heavy. Its cover a rich mahogany leather with brass hinges like a miniature chest. When you lift the lid-like cover, you realize why. It's been fitted with a false bottom, and between the last 2 pages rests a tiny brass key. Whatever that key once opened is long gone, but the diary itself reveals exactly what it was meant to protect: the record of banned books on hidden shelves. The first entry begins with the kind of sentence you can almost hear whispered: "What cannot be said aloud can always be read in the right room." A mainstream historical fact comes early. Censorship in the 18th century varied wildly between nations, but most courts and cities maintained lists of prohibited works. Some were banned for political content, others for religious reasons, and many for their scandalous depictions of love and desire. Yet in aristocratic circles, such prohibitions often served more as recommendations. The more forbidden a book, the more certain it was to be smuggled in under a false cover. Historians still argue whether these clandestine libraries were primarily for political rebels or simply for the bored elite seeking titillation. The diarist leans toward the latter, writing, "Rebellion against taste is rarer than rebellion against power." The quirky tidbit here is delicious. A certain count is said to have rebound a notorious novel in the cover of a treatise on crop rotation, so he could read it openly in the garden. The ruse was so effective that even his steward, who took great pride in discussing crop yields, never realized he was being politely ignored in favor of scenes far more heated than barley harvests. The diarist describes one of these secret shelves in detail, hidden behind a false panel in a library wall, opened by pressing a carved rosette on the mantel. Inside, books are arranged not by author or subject, but by the kind of mood one wished to summon: a quick flush, a dangerous thought, a long night. One entry recounts a gathering where a select few guests were quietly invited to the back library after the main party had retired. There, by candlelight, the host handed out copies of a newly banned philosophical tract, pretending to distribute playing cards. The thrill wasn't only in the ideas, but in the risk, the knowledge that being caught with such a book could mean social ruin, fines, or worse. The diarist admits that sometimes the danger was exaggerated for effect. Smuggling a volume from Paris to London could be accomplished with a little bribery and a sturdy hatbox. But telling the story of its perilous journey, complete with invented customs raids, made for much better salon conversation. A final anecdote catches your imagination. A lady of the court kept her banned novels hidden inside the hollowed-out casing of an old globe. Visitors would spin it idly, never realizing they were touching a map of the world stuffed with scandal. The entry closes with the wry observation: "Some read for knowledge, some for pleasure. We read to remember there is more than the room we stand in. You close the little brass-hinged diary, imagining the faint rustle of those forbidden pages in the dark and the secret smiles they must have inspired long after the candles burned low. The diary you lift next is slim and pale, its cover the colour of old ivory, with a single painted motif in one corner, a tiny fan, rendered in delicate strokes of gold and silver. The image feels almost like a clue, and when you open the book, the very first sentence confirms it. One can speak an entire sentence without ever opening one's mouth. You've stepped into the affair of the fan, a secretive, fluttering language that in 18th century aristocratic society could mean the difference between an invitation and exile. A mainstream historical fact appears almost immediately. While fan language, or elevantale, was never universally standardized, certain gestures became widely recognized in polite society. Holding a fan to one's lips might signal a desire for silence. Dropping it could indicate a meeting place. Opening it slowly might suggest interest. Snapping it shut, displeasure. Like all unspoken codes, the power lay in mutual understanding, which meant its use was limited to those in the know. Historians still argue whether this language of the fan was truly a practiced system or more of a playful affectation in fashionable circles. The diarist suspects it was both, sometimes an actual covert channel, other times a charming excuse for theatrics. The quirky tidbit here sparkles. At one masked ball, a marchioness supposedly used her fan to orchestrate a clandestine meeting with a foreign ambassador. Unfortunately, she forgot that her fan was painted with her family crest, making the identity of the flirtatious signaller immediately obvious to half the room. The diary pages hum with little dramas, a lady tilting her fan just enough to reveal a miniature portrait tucked in the folds, a gentleman reading the flick of a wrist like scripture, a rival deliberately imitating another woman's fan signals to cause confusion and delicious chaos. One entry describes an opera performance where the diarist sat in a box directly above two well-known social adversaries. The first used her fan to signal disinterest in the man seated beside her. The second responded by fluttering hers rapidly, a gesture understood to mean, "You bore me." By intermission, their fans were snapping and fluttering so furiously that the music seemed to have acquired its own percussion section. The diarist notes that fans were often chosen with these communications in mind. Some had lace panels for easier concealment of expressions. Others painted scenes that could be positioned to reveal or obscure certain images. A plain fan could be devastating, its blankness making the signal sharper, impossible to misread. There's a slyer side. Words can be denied, a fan cannot. A letter could be burned, a phrase disputed, but a fan's movement in the middle of a crowded room was witnessed by many, though only a few might grasp the full meaning. As the entry closes, the diarist recalls seeing a discarded fan on a marble bench in a private garden. Its sticks were still warm from the hand that had held it, its lace faintly scented with violets. Whether it had been dropped deliberately or forgotten in haste, the diarist never learned. "But," they write, "it was gone by morning, and so was the lady." You set the ivory-covered diary back on the stack, imagining the faint snap of lacquered sticks and the unspoken conversations they carried across candlelit rooms. The diary you open now smells faintly of leather mixed with horsehair, as though it has spent long months in a tack room. Its cover is a deep, weathered brown, the edges nicked as if from jostling in a saddlebag. Inside, the handwriting tilts forward eagerly, like someone leaning over the table to tell you a story they can't quite keep to themselves. The first line sets the scene. A hunt is not always for deer. You've arrived at the riding grounds, those sprawling, dew-soaked fields and wooded trails where aristocrats gathered for hunting parties. Ostensibly, these events were about sport, but the diarist makes it clear that far more prey was caught in conversation than in the forest. A mainstream historical fact appears early. In the 18th century, hunting was as much a social performance as it was an outdoor pursuit. Invitations to hunts were coveted not only for the fresh air and feasting, but for the rare privacy they offered. Out in the fields, away from prying ears at court, one could negotiate alliances, broker marriages, or trade in gossip that would be dangerous indoors. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of these hunts was sport or strategy. The diarist, without hesitation, leans toward the latter, remarking, "A deer may fall, but the real trophies are taken on horseback." The quirky tidbit here gallops in with a grin. The diarist recalls a certain earl who brought an absurdly small hunting horn, producing a high, squeaky note that startled the hounds and reduced half the party to laughter. Later it was whispered that he had done it deliberately, so that the noise would mask a private exchange with a lady riding beside him. You can see it clearly. Velvet riding coats dusted with frost, plumes of breath rising in the crisp morning air, horses stamping impatiently, riders pair off and drift toward the edges of the group, their voices low. A seemingly innocent conversation about the weather shifts seamlessly into talk of inheritances, political favors, and the subtle reshuffling of loyalties. The diarist describes a moment when two rivals raced neck and neck toward a fence, each determined to be the first to clear it. Both made the jump, but the real victory was in the smile one gave the other afterward. Tight, knowing, a silent promise that the competition was far from over. Sometimes the gossip was seeded days in advance. A remark made in the salon could bloom into a full-fledged rumour by the time riders reached the hunting lodge for luncheon. There, over platters of roasted game and spiced wine, the day's sport was recounted with just enough embellishment to keep everyone leaning closer. One page ends with a sly observation. Horses remember paths. People remember promises. The diarist clearly relished these outdoor gatherings, noting how the open air seemed to lower defences, making truths easier to slip into conversation. As you close the diary, you can still hear the faint jingle of bridles, the sharp bark of a hound in the distance, and the murmured exchange between two riders whose real quarry was not on four legs at all. The diary you choose next is bound in deep green Morocco leather, its surface scratched in a way that suggests it has travelled in more than one gentleman's coat pocket. It smells faintly of tobacco and cardamom, and when you open it, the first sentence is almost a toast. Some fortunes are won with cards, and others with silence. You've entered the smoky, low-lit world of private gambling rooms, spaces tucked behind respectable drawing rooms, or above fashionable coffee houses where fortunes changed hands while the rest of society assumed the players were merely enjoying a late supper. Here, gambling tables and risky confessions shared the same felt surface. A mainstream historical fact lands early. Gambling was not just tolerated in many aristocratic circles of the 18th century, it was a sign of worldliness and sophistication. Exclusive clubs and private salons often had dedicated rooms for card games like faro, whist, or piquet, and betting could extend far beyond coin. Wagers might involve land, political favours, or even the arrangement of a marriage. Historians still argue whether these gambling sessions served as genuine financial contests or were merely stages for the exchange of influence. The diarists suggest both, noting that a man who loses money may owe you silver, a man who loses a secret may owe you everything. The quirky tidbit here comes from a night at a certain marquise's gaming table. The diarist describes how one player, under pressure and 2 glasses of port past his limit, accidentally revealed the details of a clandestine engagement between a cousin and a foreign noble. The room went silent except for the shuffling of cards before the dealer smoothly announced the next hand as though nothing had happened. By morning, however, half the capital knew. The diary paints the room vividly, walls hung with thick velvet drapes to muffle sound, candlelight glinting off polished wood, the faint chime of coins being stacked and restacked by nervous fingers. A glass of brandy, left untouched, warms slowly beside an unfinished hand. Around the table, expressions are studied masks, except when a particularly bold play or careless comment cracks them wide open. Some games were deliberately slowed, the diarist notes, to give players time to drink, to talk, to slip from talk into revelation. An apparently meaningless bet on whether it would snow before midnight could be a veiled probe into someone's travel plans, or an opening to gauge their mood about a pending political vote. One entry recalls an evening where no one left richer, yet several walked away indebted in ways far more binding than gold. The cards were merely decoration, the diarist writes, but the hands were played in conversation. As the candles burned lower, the smoke hung heavier, and the rules of the room, never written down, took firmer hold. What was said here stayed here, unless it was worth far more outside. The diarist closes the entry with a knowing flourish. At the right table, the winning hand is the one that isn't played. You set the green diary aside, and you can almost feel the lingering warmth of the brandy glass and hear the soft whisper of cards sliding against each other, carrying both luck and danger in equal measure. The diary you open now is a slender volume bound in pale rose leather. The colour faded unevenly as though it spent years lying half in sunlight on a dressing table. Its clasp is gone, replaced by a thin ribbon that smells faintly of rosewater. Inside, the script is looping and elegant, written with the confidence of someone who enjoys recording patterns as much as events. The first line reads, "Affections like the seasons are best anticipated." You've stepped into the cycle of seasonal courtships and strategic breakups, a rhythm as predictable as the turning of the year in 18th century aristocratic life. A mainstream historical fact emerges immediately. For many members of high society, the season was not simply a poetic term, but a literal calendar of opportunity. In cities like London and Paris, the social season coincided with parliament sessions and royal events, drawing the elite into town for balls, theatre, and the endless carousel of dinners. It was a time to forge alliances, renew connections, and, more often than not, begin or end relationships with precise timing. Historians still argue whether these seasonal romances were driven by genuine emotion or purely by convenience. The diarist sees them as a blend, remarking, "Love may be blind, but it can read a calendar." The quirky tidbit here is almost comedic. The diarist recalls a young count who proposed to 3 different women in 3 successive seasons, each time timing his courtship to align with the height of spring festivities. By the 4th year, the city's gossip columns began referring to him as the annual bloom, a nickname he wore like a badge. You can picture the orchestration, winter months in the country spent corresponding just enough to keep interest alive, spring arrivals in the capital greeted with carefully planned encounters, perhaps a chance meeting during a promenade, a shared carriage after a theatre performance, a bouquet of flowers chosen for symbolic meaning. Summer saw declarations whispered in gardens or on moonlit balconies. By autumn, some romances cooled conveniently, freeing both parties for other pursuits before the next season began. The diarist describes how breakups were handled with a kind of practiced elegance. A sudden trip abroad, a claim of focusing on family matters, or an increase in public appearances with a new companion, all were acceptable ways to end things without sparking scandal. And yet, the end of a romance often came with its own coded signals. A returned fan, an altered dance card, the absence of a certain name from a dinner invitation. One entry details a particularly well-timed mutual separation between 2 well-connected figures, engineered so that both could immediately begin more advantageous matches without anyone accusing them of fickleness. The diarist dryly observes, "It was the only waltz in which they moved apart perfectly in step." There's a faint undercurrent of admiration in the diarist's tone, as if recognizing the discipline it took to treat love like part of the social machinery, something to be tuned, adjusted, and polished according to the demands of the moment. The entry closes with a final note that feels like both warning and invitation. In a season's game, the clever know when to arrive, the wise know when to leave. You close the rose-coloured diary, almost hearing the faint echo of dance music fading into the night as one set of partners drifts apart and another draws closer under the glimmer of chandeliers. The diary you choose next is bound in black lacquered leather, its surface so glossy it reflects the flicker of candlelight. Along one edge, faint scratches form a rhythm, as though the book had been tapped by impatient fingers while its owner waited for someone who was late. When you open it, the first line arrives like the pluck of a harp string. Some notes are played for the room, others are played for one person alone. You step into the music room's hidden notes, those moments when sheet music became more than melody, when a composition could carry a secret as surely as a sealed letter. A mainstream historical fact unfurls quickly. In 18th century aristocratic culture, musical performances in private homes were not just entertainment, but a platform for displaying refinement, wealth, and, occasionally, subtle messages. Composers and skilled amateurs alike sometimes embedded coded references into their pieces, a familiar tune woven briefly into a sonata, a certain key or rhythm associated with a shared memory. Historians still argue how often such codes were intentional versus imagined by romantic minds. The diarist is certain they were deliberate, noting, "An audience hears the music, the intended hears the meaning." The quirky tidbit comes in the form of a whispered anecdote. A young pianist once performed a gavotte that subtly incorporated the first notes of a well-known love song, but inverted and slowed so that only the intended recipient seated across the room recognized it. The rest of the audience applauded politely. The recipient blushed furiously and refused to meet the performer's eyes for the remainder of the evening. The diary paints the music room in meticulous detail, candlelight catching the gleam of polished wood, the faint scent of beeswax and rosin, the rustle of silk skirts as guests settle into gilt chairs. The air holds that expectant hush that falls just before the first note, one in which every listener is alone with their thoughts, and yet every glance is noticed. The diarist describes the thrill of receiving a message in this way. A certain sequence of chords could recall a moonlit conversation in a garden. A sudden change in tempo might reference a private joke. Even the length of a pause between movements could speak volumes. The longer the silence, the diarist writes, the heavier the words inside it. One entry tells of a masquerade where a violinist, disguised in a plain black mask, slipped an entire hidden melody into the background music during a dance. The partner who recognized it smiled only once, briefly, before spinning away into the crowd. The rest of the guests never knew they had witnessed a conversation entirely without words. The diarist closes with a thought that lingers like a fading chord. A note leaves no paper trail, but its echo can last a lifetime. You shut the lacquered diary, and for a moment you can almost hear the ghost of a harpsichord in the corner, playing something so quiet you have to lean closer, not to the instrument, but to the person it's meant for. The diary you take next is weighty and formal, bound in oxblood leather with a clasp shaped like a quill pen. The gilt on the spine has dulled to a burnished copper, as though it has been handled by someone who read it often, perhaps to savour the power of the events within. The very first line wastes no words. A man may write his will in ink, but in society it is written in whispers. This is the scandal of a changed will, a phenomenon both feared and anticipated in 18th century aristocratic life. A mainstream historical fact settles early into the narrative. Wills at this time could be altered up until the very last breath of the testator. Legal formalities existed, but the social reality was far more fluid. A favoured heir today could be entirely cut out tomorrow if they displeased the benefactor, or if another party's influence suddenly outweighed theirs. Historians still argue how often these last-minute changes were genuine acts of reconsideration versus manipulations by those with access to the dying. The diarist clearly suspects the latter, writing, "Deathbeds are crowded with those who wish to be remembered." The quirky tidbit arrives like a bitter cherry atop the cake. One duke, notorious for his shifting affections, was said to have changed his will 7 times in the last year of his life. The final change, made, according to rumour, while propped up in bed between sips of fortified wine, left the bulk of his estate to a distant cousin no one had met. The cousin's sudden appearance at the funeral, dressed head to toe in mourning silk, was described by the diarist as the finest theatrical entrance of the season. You can see the drama play out in drawing rooms and writing chambers alike. The diarist details the signs, sudden invitations to dinner from an aging relative, gifts of imported delicacies sent just because, and frequent visits under the guise of reading aloud from the latest novel. Behind every kindness lay the quiet hope that it might translate into lines of ink on thick parchment. One vivid scene in the diary recounts the moment a sealed will was read aloud to the gathered family. As the solicitor's voice droned, the air grew heavy, punctuated by sharp intakes of breath, the faint clink of a glass being set down too hard, and one audible sigh of relief from a man who had clearly feared the worst. "The dead may be silent," the diarist observes, "but they speak loudly enough through the gasps they leave behind." There's a particular cruelty in the fact that a change of will is final. No debate, no appeal, no chance to clarify the deceased's intentions. The diarist recounts how entire branches of a family tree could be pruned in an instant, replaced by newly grafted names whose roots lay in flattery rather than blood. The entry closes with a line written in a hand that presses the quill harder than usual, leaving faint indents even on the opposite page. To inherit is to be chosen, to be cut out is to be remembered differently. You close the oxblood diary, and for a moment, imagine the sound of a key turning in the lock of a desk drawer, the soft finality of a decision that will not be known until it is far too late to change it. The diary you lift now is slim, bound in buttery tan leather that has darkened around the edges where fingers once gripped it often. The corners are scuffed, the spine slightly warped, as though it has spent years being tucked into baskets or pockets. When you open it, a faint scent of pomade drifts up, and the very first line makes you smile. If you want the truth, ask the person holding the comb. This is the hairdresser's hotline, a network as efficient as any postal service, moving gossip through curls, pins, and powder. A mainstream historical fact appears almost immediately. In 18th century high society, hairdressers were not just stylists, they were fixtures in their clients' lives. They were invited into private chambers, present during dressing and undressing, privy to whispered confidences and raw emotions. The work could take hours, especially when assembling towering coiffures or elaborate wigs, giving plenty of time for conversation. Historians still argue whether hairdressers were deliberate spreaders of gossip or simply unavoidable conduits. The diarist, however, is blunt. When one has the ears of 3 households before noon, silence is a fiction. The quirky tidbit here comes from a certain Parisian coiffeur who reportedly hid tiny slips of paper in his wig powder boxes, pre-written morsels of gossip, so that by the time he left a house, the latest tidbit had already been planted in another. "Like bees with pollen," the diarist notes dryly. You can picture it clearly. The hairdresser's hands moving quickly, comb teasing out tangles, while their voice hums with practiced neutrality. "Of course I wouldn't say who told me, madam," they might murmur, even as they adjust a hairpin in just the way that signals a story worth remembering. The diary recounts scenes of hairdressers moving between clients like diplomats, soothing one woman's outrage with flattery, tempering another's glee with caution. Sometimes they delivered warnings in the form of hairstyle suggestions, recommending a more modest look if a rival was preparing a dramatic entrance, or encouraging an extravagant flourish to outshine someone rumoured to be planning the same. One page describes a morning in which a hairdresser, working on a marchioness, casually mentioned that a certain count had been seen in the park in the company of a lady whose fan told quite the story. By that evening, the marchioness had arranged to attend the same opera as the count, and the diarist suspects the hairdresser had intended exactly that outcome. The atmosphere in these rooms was unlike any other, intimate. Scented with pomade and orange blossom water, the air filled with the faint hiss of heated curling tongs. Here, a sigh or a raised eyebrow could be as telling as a full confession. The diarist notes that some hairdressers develop their own subtle signals to regular clients: a tug on a ribbon to mean "be cautious," a twist of the comb to mean "you'll want to hear this." The entry ends with a line that feels like a truth disguised as a compliment. One may trust a friend, but a hairdresser, one must. You close the tan diary, still hearing the snip of scissors and the rustle of silk as clients rose from their chairs, newly coiffed, newly informed, and ready to step into the next round of society's theatre. The diary you select next is small and foxed at the edges, bound in pale cream calfskin that once matched a pair of gloves, if the shade along the spine is any clue. Someone has pressed a dried ribbon inside like a bookmark. When you lift it, a faint imprint remains, the outline of a hand no longer there. The first sentence is a whisper with teeth. A glove, when misplaced, is an accusation that pretends to be lost. You step into the stolen glove mystery, one of those tiny social dramas that begins with an innocent question and ends with a guest list rearranged like troops on a map. In the 18th century rooms you've been haunting, gloves do more than warm fingers. They cover touch, transmit meaning, and carry scent, which is to say, they store evidence like a locket does a portrait. You already feel your shoulders relaxing into the familiar rhythm, chandeliers humming, skirts rustling, the polite thud of a heart speeding up because one glove has decided to go rogue. The diarist starts on a winter's afternoon in a city townhouse, snow feathering the windows, a fire banked low, servants moving like shadows. Guests arrive for cards and chocolate. They peel off cloaks, shake out powdered wigs, and lay their gloves along a side table where a porcelain hound keeps watch with permanently baffled eyes. You drift with the diarist past the decanters, labelled truth and silence. You remember that butler's joke. Past the music room where a violinist sketches a private thread of melody for someone who's trying not to hear, and into the salon where the real hunt, remember the riding grounds, takes place over velvet chairs rather than hedges. A mainstream historical fact lands with a courteous nod. Gloves in the 18th century are practical, yes, but also etiquette embodied. Fashion manuals and polite conduct books insist you do not extend a bare hand to strangers. Elaborate social rituals, the bow, the curtsy, the dance, often begin or end with the managed removal or replacement of a glove. Exchanging a glove can signal favour. Returning one can end an understanding without a single loud word. No wonder a missing glove behaves like a small, scented grenade. The diarist's entry unfolds like a card trick you can't quite follow until the reveal. A viscountess notices one of her ivory kidskin gloves is gone. She laughs, too brightly, and asks if anyone has seen it. Not to worry, she trills. She's certain it simply slipped behind a cushion. This is not a cushion kind of glove. This is the kind of glove that holds the warmth of a recent hand and the faintest breath of violet perfume that has, unfortunately, starred in more than one of our diaries. You feel the room take a tiny step closer. Lost and found becomes found and dangerous when a young gentleman, let's call him unfortunate, produces the glove from his pocket with a smile meant to be charming, and instead fumbles his life. "I intended to return it discreetly," he says, which is a sentence nobody in a room like this believes. If discretion was the plan, one does not stand, clear one's throat, and offer the item like a trophy. The Viscountess grows paler. Her husband grows still. Fans begin their soft percussion section, open, close, open, an orchestra we've learned to read. Somewhere, a hairdresser in a different house is already sharpening a comb to carry tomorrow's version of this story. Historians still argue, the diarist writes, whether such objects truly travelled by chance pocket or by design. Was the glove planted? Was it carelessly tucked into a coat during a hurried exit from a garden folly? Was our gentleman ambushed by the universal enemy, an over-eager valet who assumed this, too, was an errand? You weigh the possibilities like cards fanned on green baize. The diarist refuses to pick a winner, which is wise. Mystery travels farther than certainty. The evening shifts into detective theatre. The hostess asks, light as meringue, that the butler fetched the porcelain tray from the console, the one painted with a shepherd who is obviously underdressed for January, and invites all present to place their gloves upon it to avoid further confusion. It's a gambit of genius, turning an accusation into a ritual. Guests comply with exaggerated cheer, making a show of counting their pairs like misbehaving children. 2 left gloves appear. You think fondly of the count who wore 2 left shoes. 1 pair trimmed in sable that sheds on the tray like a cat in a bad mood. Hello again, so long cat. And a dramatic scarlet pair that announces its wearer has no intention of being a background character. Then comes the quirky tidbit that makes you choke on your imaginary chocolate. A gentleman produces a lemon from his pocket, yes, a lemon, and explains, solemn as a bishop, that he uses citrus to keep his gloves supple in winter. There is an audible ripple of laughter that thinks it is a cough. You and the diarist remember every cursed lemon in this city, from coded rinds to punch bowls, and you cannot decide whether the universe is tidy or cruel. The hostess rescues him with a compliment on innovative glove care, so deadpan the marble statues feel shade. Meanwhile, the Viscountess's single glove sits on the shepherd tray like an indictment. It is creased in a way that suggests being folded small, palm over palm, then flattened by something heavier than its mate. A pocket, a book, a heart, if we are sentimental, and the room is encouraging us to be. The diarist sketches the moments with quick strokes, the husband's jaw, the rival's fan, the servant's sideways glance that knows where mirrors stand and sound carries. Over by the harpsichord, the pianist idles through a gavotte that, if you listen for it, briefly inverts a love song. We have been here before. The music room sends telegrams without paper. The investigation, because that's what it becomes, is conducted in sugar and silk. Where were you when you last wore it? Who sat beside you at tea? Did you place it upon the chair near the fire? No one places anything near the fire if they wish to see it again. The butler, courteous as a chess master, suggests that the house's servants search the vestibule and the cloakroom. You know the quiet power of servants. They can find a rumour in a locked drawer. The diarist's tone softens when describing them now, as if acknowledging that the people who dust the chandeliers are also the ones who keep the roof on. Soon, the possibilities narrow. The glove did not slide off during a minuet. It did not hide beneath a cushion with delusions of upholstery. It travelled in a pocket, unfortunate's pocket, between the card room, where truth and silence once poured, and the small gallery where private portraits hang. You feel a cool draught of memory. Tiny faces painted on ivory, a mole above a collarbone, a story told without words. The implications multiply like rabbits left unattended in a topiary maze. If a glove is proof of nearness, whose nearness does it prove? If a gentleman carried it, was he messenger or thief? If he is messenger, for whom? If thief, why keep the evidence until the moment of maximum audience? The diarist, who has a sense of theatre, writes that the Viscountess replaced her remaining glove with the ceremony of a coronation. An elegant, deliberate pull over each finger, a final tug at the wrist. The missing twin, returned by the butler from a back hallway search, lies now upon the tray. Everyone inhales. The butler murmurs, "Found behind the green settee, madam," which is both comforting and useless, because behind the green settee is exactly where one goes to say things that should never be said anywhere. The husband studies the glove as though it might confess. He then does something that will be discussed for months. He lifts it by 2 fingers and offers it to his wife with a bow so perfect it feels rehearsed. "Carelessness is unfashionable," he says mildly, the sort of line that sounds like forgiveness and behaves like a blade. The room exhales the way crowds do after a duel not quite fought. Cards resume. Someone orders almonds, because of course they do. The monarchy's gaze has turned a snack into a sacrament, and the price in the city will surge again by morning. Quietly, the diarist records the aftermath. Invitations dry up for our unfortunate gentleman. A hairdresser accidentally schedules him an early appointment on the day of a much-anticipated salon, ensuring he arrives late and misses the opening salvo of witticisms, which is when alliances set. The music teacher forgets his lesson. The riding master finds his saddle in need of endless, inconvenient repairs. Society doesn't always cut with a duel. Sometimes it sands you down with absence. Still, there is mercy where you expect only sport. The lady's maid, remember, the keepers of maps and stair squeaks, slips a note to the Viscountess's dressing table. Your hem, not your heart, caught behind the settee. Alongside the note rests a single pin bent in the shape that occurs when snag meets panic. It is a small, kindly truth offered by the only witness who benefits nothing from it. The Viscountess, the diarist writes, places the bent pin in her jewel box as if it were a diamond that had learned humility. As for the glove, it resumes its duties, covering a hand that waves at enemies and squeezes allies and, sometimes, sits absolutely still, while a portrait painter decides where the gaze should fall. Weeks later, at a masquerade, the Viscountess wears both gloves and a mask plain as night. She dances once with her husband, once with no one, and once with fate, which steps on even the best trained feet. Was the glove stolen, planted, borrowed for a breath, and pocketed by mistake? Historians still argue whether the glove was the story or the excuse, the diarist concludes. I only know that everyone behaved as if meaning had been proved, which in these rooms of fan flutter and coded music is the same as proof. You close the cream-coloured diary, feeling the soft ghost of goatskin against your palm. Somewhere behind you, a cat knocks a spoon from a saucer. Perfect timing. And in another house, a butler polishes the shepherd tray until it reflects back a crowd of faces trying and failing to look uncurious. Remember our first diarist's line, to write is to confess without speaking, to lose a glove is to confess without words, then keep attending parties anyway. The diary you draw next is bound in a warm chestnut leather, worn smooth in the middle as though someone's thumb had rested there over years of rereading. A faint scent of pine clings to it, mixed with something richer. Perhaps the memory of a fireplace in a grand hall. The very first line draws you straight into summer air. The country frees the tongue faster than wine. You've arrived at the country estate retreat, those sprawling homes far from the capital where aristocrats fled when the city became too hot, politically, socially, or simply in weather. Here, distance from the court brought looser morals, easier laughter, and a dangerous illusion of privacy. A mainstream historical fact surfaces immediately. By the 18th century, many prominent families maintained country estates not just for leisure, but as strategic stages for political negotiations, courtships, and discreet liaisons. The slower pace of rural life encouraged long walks, drawn-out dinners, and social gatherings where the guest list could be curated without fear of urban gossip columns, though, as the diarist makes clear, news from the countryside had a way of galloping back to the city in record time. Historians still argue whether these retreats truly offered freedom from scrutiny or simply a different form of it. The diarist writes, "A hedge may block the view from the road, but it cannot stop a gardener's ears." The quirky tidbit here makes you smile. At one particular estate, a footman was instructed to ring a small handbell twice if he spotted the local vicar approaching, giving the household just enough time to separate certain pairs of guests before the clergyman stepped inside. You can feel the estate unfold around you, long gravel drives lined with lime trees, manicured lawns giving way to wildflower meadows, and stone terraces warmed by the sun. The days begin with late breakfasts under striped awnings where conversations drift lazily from politics to scandal. Afternoons are filled with rides through the parkland, picnics by the lake, or games of battledore and shuttlecock, played with more competitiveness than the genteel laughter suggests. The diarist sketches one scene in particular, a hunting party that left with 20 riders and returned with 21, an uninvited neighbour who somehow managed to lose his way directly onto the estate. He was promptly invited to stay for dinner, an act of courtesy that would later be questioned after his name began appearing in whispered conversations in town. Evenings in the country took on their own rhythm. Without the constant pressure of city entertainments, Guests invented amusements, charades, impromptu concerts, moonlit garden walks. The diarist notes that these walks were a double-edged sword. Half the household used them for quiet confessions, the other half to intercept them. One entry recounts a summer when an entire dinner party was delayed because a lady's small lapdog went missing, only to be found asleep in the lap of a guest who had retreated to the library for some fresh air. Whether the dog wandered in by chance or was carried in as cover for a conversation remains deliciously unclear. The diary ends this section with a wry truth. In the city, one performs for the crowd. In the country, one performs for the diary. You close the chestnut-coloured book, feeling the hum of those lazy days and long nights, knowing that behind the warmth of country hospitality often lay the sharpest manoeuvres of all. The diary you take next is bound in deep midnight leather, the surface faintly scuffed as if from being tucked under an arm during a hurried departure. When you open it, a faint trace of spilled claret stains the lower corner of the first page. The opening line wastes no time. After midnight, the masks fall, whether or not they were ever on the face. You've stepped into that treacherous hour when the formalities of the evening are wearing thin, the music is softer, and manners begin to fray. Mask slipping at midnight is less about literal disguises and more about the moment when cultivated personas falter, revealing truths carefully hidden during daylight. A mainstream historical fact grounds you quickly. In 18th century society, late-night gatherings, whether in grand salons, private gaming rooms, or the final dances of a ball, were often when alliances were forged or broken. Alcohol had loosened tongues, rivalries had been sharpened over the course of the evening, and the audience for one's behaviour had thinned to only those close enough to matter. Historians still argue whether the late-hour truth is genuine or merely another performance. The diarist is unconvinced by sincerity, noting, even a stumble can be rehearsed if the right eyes are watching. The quirky tidbit here makes you smirk. At one particularly raucous winter ball, a famously reserved marchioness was seen laughing, truly laughing, at a joke whispered by a man widely known to be her fiercest critic. By morning, rumours swirled that they were secretly allies, perhaps even co-conspirators. The diarist admits the truth was likely simpler. The marchioness had mistaken his identity in the dim light and thought she was laughing with someone else entirely. You picture the rooms in this hour, candle stubs burning low in their sconces, the air thick with the scent of spilt wine, wax, and too many hours of perfume. A few couples linger in the shadows of tall drapes. Others sit at abandoned card tables, idly shuffling decks more for the comfort of the motion than the game. Servants move more slowly now, eyes hooded, the weight of the evening heavy in their arms as they clear glasses and right overturned chairs. The diarist describes the fascinating fragility of faces at this hour. A practiced smile might droop at the edges, revealing fatigue, resentment, or longing. A glance that would be careful at 9 o'clock strays too long at 2. Even the pitch of voices changes, lower, slower, or, in some cases, pitched high with brittle gaiety. One page details a moment when a viscount, emboldened by brandy, confided a political scheme to a supposed ally. The ally listened intently, nodding, only to slip away and relay the entire plan to a rival waiting in the antechamber. By breakfast, the scheme was not just ruined, but turned entirely against its originator. The diarist notes dryly, he mistook the warmth of the room for the warmth of the company. There's a tenderness in some of these midnight slips, too. The diarist recalls watching a widowed countess remove the elaborate jewelled comb from her hair, letting her curls fall loose. She caught her own reflection in the mirror and smiled, not the social smile for others, but something gentler, private. That moment, the diarist insists, was the most genuine thing seen all season. The entry closes with a line as soft as the hush that falls when the final carriage departs. At midnight, no one is entirely who they were at supper, and some will never be again. You shut the midnight blue diary, feeling the echo of that fragile hour, when masks, real or imagined, slip just enough for the truth to glance out before retreating again into the safety of morning. The diary you lift now is bound in black calfskin so smooth it feels almost slippery, like something meant to pass unnoticed from one set of hands to another. A narrow silk ribbon marks the place, and when you open it, the first words are written in a precise, almost surgical script. A letter is sharpest when it smiles. You've stepped into the world of blackmail in the age of lace, where threats are wrapped in politeness, and a single folded sheet of paper can carry more weight than a king's decree. A mainstream historical fact appears quickly. In the 18th century, libel laws existed but were difficult to enforce in cases of private correspondence. Blackmail often flourished in the grey space between rumour and proof, where an incriminating letter, portrait or diary entry could be quietly returned for a price. Because reputation was the foundation of aristocratic power, many paid without hesitation, preferring silent loss over public scandal. Historians still argue whether blackmail was truly rampant or simply feared into myth. The diarist insists it was common enough to shape behaviour, writing, "One is never entirely alone in a room where paper exists." The quirky tidbit here has just enough absurdity to be real. A certain Viscount allegedly sent himself an anonymous threatening letter, then used it as an excuse to avoid attending a dull political function. Unfortunately, he forgot to disguise his handwriting, and the ruse was exposed when his butler, who had delivered the note, recognized the loops in the capital G. The diarist paints the mechanics vividly, letters folded so many times their edges could cut, wax seals impressed with crests, sanded down to anonymity, the faintest dusting of perfume or tobacco giving away the sender. Sometimes the message was all implication. "We were both at the masquerade last Tuesday. I wonder if others noticed your fondness for the lady in blue." Sometimes it was brutally clear. "Return the miniature by Thursday, or it will be shown to your wife at supper." These exchanges rarely happened in isolation. The diarist recounts one case where a lady, threatened over a set of love letters, quietly hired another party to blackmail her blackmailer, creating a daisy chain of extortion that collapsed only when one link fled the country. There is an art to the tone of these letters. Too harsh, and the target might risk exposure rather than pay. Too mild, and they might ignore the threat entirely. The diarist admires a particular masterpiece sent to a certain marquise. A graceful thank-you note for a recent dinner, followed by a postscript in smaller hand, suggesting that the marquise's evening in the orangery might make excellent reading material for the next issue of a certain scandal sheet. Payment was made within the week. One page reveals the most dangerous form of all, blackmail without paper. A conversation over tea, a remark dropped as a compliment, could leave the victim with no proof, yet every incentive to comply. Words vanish, the diarist writes, but the fear remains tangible. The entry ends with a line that tightens like a drawstring. "Lace hides many seams, but none so well as the seam between courtesy and coercion." You close the black diary slowly, almost expecting to find an unsigned note slipped inside. For a moment, you can hear the faint crackle of sealing wax cooling, and you imagine every envelope in the room might carry not an invitation, but a demand. The diary you select next is bound in crimson leather, its surface faintly mottled, as though it had once been splashed with wine and wiped clean before the stain could fully set. The edges of the pages are gilt, but dulled from being thumbed too often. When you open it, the first line is written with a flourish so extravagant it nearly tangles itself. Some parties are thrown for pleasure. This one was thrown for camouflage. You've entered the last ball before ruin, a glittering, desperate performance staged by a family teetering on the brink of scandal-induced collapse. A mainstream historical fact emerges almost at once. In the 18th century, the grand ball was as much a declaration of stability as it was a celebration. Hosting an opulent gathering signaled that one's fortunes and reputation were secure even if both were secretly in tatters. In some cases, these events were orchestrated to distract from brewing financial disaster, political disgrace, or an impending social exile. Historians still argue whether such events fooled anyone for long. The diarist, with a sharpened sense for artifice, writes, "A candle burns brightest before the snuff." The quirky tidbit here is tinged with tragic comedy. At one such ball, the host family, deep in debt, borrowed their own silverware back from a pawnbroker for the night, promising to return it before dawn. The diarist notes that at least 3 guests commented on how well-polished the forks looked, without realizing the polish was desperation. You see the evening unfold in decadent detail. The ballroom dressed to dazzle with swags of imported silk, crystal chandeliers dripping light across polished parquet, and musicians hired at double their usual fee to ensure no one suspected a budget. Guests arrive in carriages that crunch over gravel, unaware, or perhaps pretending not to know, that the house itself has already been quietly offered for sale. The diarist moves among the crowd, noting every tiny crack in the facade, the slightly mismatched candles in the sconces, the hurried stitching in the hostess's gown where lace had been repurposed from an older dress, the way the champagne is poured into smaller glasses to stretch the supply. And yet, the performance works, for a while. Laughter swells, dancers whirl, and the air hums with that peculiar electricity born from beauty standing at the edge of collapse. One page describes the moment the hostess steps onto the floor for the first dance with her husband. They move in perfect time, their smiles radiant. But the diarist catches the way their hands grip just a little too tightly, as if holding on to something neither wants to drop. Not just each other, but the entire illusion. Rumours swirl discreetly in corners, whispers about a lawsuit, about unpaid debts, about a cousin's indiscretion that could topple more than just the family name. Yet for tonight, those whispers are drowned by music, the thrum of conversation, and the rhythmic sweep of skirts across the floor. The diarist closes the entry with an image that lingers. As dawn begins to pale the sky, the last guests depart, their carriages rolling away into the mist. Inside, servants begin clearing the wreckage of the night, crumbled pastries, wilting flowers, candle stubs. The hostess stands alone in the ballroom, one hand resting on the back of a chair, looking at the floor as though trying to remember the exact steps of the dance. "If ruin must come," the diarist writes, "let it at least arrive dressed in silk and lit by chandeliers." You close the crimson diary, still feeling the echo of that final waltz, the music lingering just long enough to cover the sound of the first crack spreading through a once solid facade. The diary you open last is brittle at the edges, its leather crazed like a dry riverbed. You ease the clasp, and the spine sighs, a tiny, old-house creak that feels like permission. Fading ink swims up from the page in warmer browns than the earlier books, and you realize how far you've traveled through other people's midnights. You turn the last brittle leaves, and you're met with a sentence that could have been written by any of them. "I will say only what the paper can bear." You smile, because after everything, the fans, the lemons, the almonds, the masks, the duels at dawn, paper has borne quite a lot. You read slower now, the diarist's lines are shorter, as if they're conserving breath. Names are reduced to initials, places shrink to a certain house by the park. There's a tenderness here that the sharp young entries didn't allow. The hand that once carved gossip like a cameo now strokes it once and lets it go. And yet what isn't written swells like hidden orchestration under a minuet. You've learned to hear that by now. You've learned to read a silence. A mainstream historical fact drifts across the page like the shadow of a chandelier. So much of 18th century memory comes to us in iron gall ink, the kind that goes down blue-black and ages to sepia, sometimes eating the paper itself with slow, invisible teeth. Archivists call it ink burn. It's oddly fitting that the very words that tried to preserve a life can also, slowly, devour it. The diarist doesn't know that term, but they know the feeling. "My lines are paler," they write, "and I am not surprised." You find a margin recipe for making pounce, the gritty drying powder, shaken over fresh ink, ground cuttlefish bone, if you please, or eggshell, baked and crushed to a dust that hisses when it lands. That's your quirky tidbit, tucked between a list of supper guests and a sketch of a glove, that glove, with a tiny bend where a pin once caught. You imagine a pounce pot rattling softly while someone decides whether to write a name or an initial, a truth or a breath around the truth. The callbacks arrive on cue like familiar faces stepping through a doorway. A cat sketched in 2 strokes at the bottom of a salon page, useful creature, the diarist notes, brought down a cup at just the right moment. A lemon misdrawn into something like the moon. Do not etch on rind unless one is prepared to be drunk by strangers. An almond pressed flat as a coin, the market followed a glance, how silly and how true. A fan painted with a crest half erased, a miniature rendered as an oval with a dot for the collarbone's secret mole. The hat, as tall as candle smoke, drifting through a doorway and scraping the chandelier again. The country estate's bell rings twice in the margin. In a different hand, perhaps the same hand years later, someone adds simply, "We made the vicar tea." You sense the servants moving like constellations below the text, always there, rarely named. The hand behind the tray has penciled a reminder to send coins to the laundry maid after an unfortunate wine splash that you and I know was a sword scratch at breakfast. In another corner, a valet's neat note, almonds restocked, master cured of fashion. You hear the ghost laughter from the servants' hall, the boot that went admirably missing, the unionized cat filing another spoon to the floor with impeccable timing. The music room whispers one last phrase, a tiny motif drawn on a stave, the first 4 notes of that inverted love song tucked between Wednesday and opera. The diarist adds a wry aside, played softly, and you can't help but grin. After months of candlelit code, you almost miss the absurd clarity of a plain sentence. But plain sentences always arrive right before dawn. You keep turning. There's a line about a portrait unveiling where every smile looked borrowed, a line about a duel that concluded with breakfast, the best kind, a line about the back library and its false panel that sticks when it rains. You remember the brass-hinged book with the little key, and you wonder which room it once commanded. If this were a stage, you'd be backstage by now, looking at the pulleys. Historians still argue, the diarist writes, whether diaries reveal or perform. Are these confessions, or are they costumes tailored in ink? Were the travel wonders seen or sewn together from engravings? Did the glove fall or fly? Was the last ball true joy or silk-lined triage? You've lived in these rooms long enough to accept the ugliest and the kindest answer at once. Both, often both. The world is rarely one fan movement. It's usually a whole choreography. There is a final party, naturally. Not the crimson last ball, we danced that one already, but a smaller supper with the same old mirrors. The diarist notes the seating, forgiveness next to pride, wit beside worry, silence opposite the person who can't resist filling it. The sugared almonds are back, of course, and so is the king's absent gaze, still dictating prices years after it wandered across a bowl. Someone makes a miniature toast with 2 small glasses to stretch the bottle, you remember why, and someone else laughs a breath too late. Our diarist records none of their names and every one of their gestures. It's devastating and fair. On the very last leaf, the ink trembles, not from fear, from evening. A hand grown careful writes it out slowly, the way you set down a glass you're not ready to empty. I have not told everything, I have told what I could live with. Then a pause, then a gift. If you are reading, you know the rest between the lines. You close the cover. The library exhales, perfume that has no bottle left, still hangs, patient as dust in slant light. Outside, carriages you can't see go on rattling through other centuries. Inside, the diaries sit in their ranks, hats and gloves and portraits and fans, servants' hands steady on the mirrors, lemons mercifully unetched, almonds mercilessly fashionable, music hiding small truths in old keys. You press your palm to the leather as if to warm it, and the leather strokes back with all the lives it has kept. You were never supposed to be here, but you are, and you leave without taking a single page. That's your performance. That's your confession. The room is quiet now. The doors, which have been opening and closing all night, stand still. Candlelight narrows to soft beads, and the last scents of ink and powdered hair drift into the corners like shy cats, finding their places. You rest your head back and let the whole house settle. Floors, chandeliers, garden shadows, the distant lane where wheels once hummed, until everything becomes a low, even breath. You let the faces blur the way oil paint does when you step too close. The music softens into a single line, then a hum, then the hush that follows the end of a perfect phrase. Silk rustles, then stills. Fans close. Portrait eyes, so stern a moment ago, soften into warm varnish and quiet colour. Out in the grounds, the moon trades shapes with the hedges and leaves them indistinguishable, a kind, grey field where every path is the right one because every path is rest. The diaries are back on their shelves, spines aligned, ribbons sleeping. You don't have to remember every detail. The house remembers for you. Let it carry the almonds, the gloves, the careful bows, the dances that turned and came back smiling. Let it fold up the duels and the jokes and the tiny mercies and set them in the drawer with the pounce pot and the bent pin that proved a hem was guilty and a heart was not. Breathe in slowly, as if you're drawing the last note toward you. Breathe out longer, as if you're setting it gently down, where it can't roll away. The air is safe. The ink is dry. What mattered, stayed. What didn't drifted off with the dust, and the dust is soft. You are here, unhurried, unrequired to decide which parts were performance, and which were confession. Let the edges blur, let the pages close, let the house dim to the tender grey of early morning, where even scandal yawns, smiles, and curls up under a shawl. Now sleep. The stories will wait. The doors are latched, the cat has stopped knocking spoons, and the last candle has decided it's all right to be a small gold pearl. Your breath is steady. The night is gentle. Nothing fragile needs to be held up anymore.